All right, great to see everybody. I'm sorry we're not in Braunschweig. This is one of the highlights of my every 2 or 3 years coming to these conferences. But I hope that we'll all join together in person soon. So this is not the topic that I originally proposed, which was a micro study of Jewish settlement patterns in my city of Syracuse in the United States. It's something very different. And it's based on the project, comes out of the project that was just mentioned, that we're beginning during the pandemic with the Center for Jewish Art at Hebrew University and the Miller Center at University of Miami. We've been developing this online database. A prototype is ready, and maybe we can talk about it later, but we'll be engaging more people as we go forward. So this paper, which is somewhat impressionistic, not as detailed and academic as the previous two papers, grows from that and also from some courses that I've been teaching over the last few years. I think the database is focused on identifying and describing individual monuments and their histories, which will allow them to be studied and compared with other individual monuments for a variety of reasons. But more and more, I've come to see that in many cities, monuments, which we're defining very broad, which I define very broadly for this paper, can and should be read in another way, too, as part of larger histories and larger citywide landscapes of memory. Taken together, all these monuments create an extensive memorial landscape. Let's see if I move this. Trying to get to the next. There we go. Okay. There have been several efforts to digitally map cities and to locate all their historic buildings and monuments. And of course, we just heard a remarkable presentation about the Denkmal Atlas for Niedersachsen. And there are a few instances where Holocaust history has also been mapped and which show the bloody intent of the Nazi murder machinery. A recent excellent example is the Locker of Memory project, where conceptual artist Karen Frostig began to investigate the Jungfernhof concentration camp outside of Riga. And I should say that's where a lot of the Jews from Hanover found themselves. And this led to a much more detailed interdisciplinary study and mapping of the city's Holocaust history, a history that has often been repressed, as was discussed at a conference on, quote, difficult memory held in Riga just last week, which I was able to participate in. This multimedia online project will eventually lead to the installation of a physical monument at the Jungfernhof site, which may in turn inspire other commemorative markers. A much larger project is the Jewish Places interactive map about Jewish life in Germany, which I think was debuted in 2018 from the Jewish Museum in Berlin. This, I think, is the largest interactive online effort to map Jewish spaces and also collect information not only on places, but on events and personal memories. But it is not comprehensive. It is something that is being built as time passes. In Riga and elsewhere, they were not just Jews were not just confined to one. Were not just confined to one place, but they were distributed in many places. And large camp complexes might have had scores of subcamps throughout Europe. Labor crews might work on construction in other sites and other projects all throughout a city. There could be houses from which Jews were taken, located in every district. And there could be houses in which Jews were detained in other districts that were then transformed into ghettos. These places remain largely unknown and unremembered. A smaller number of places have become surrogates for all of the sites of suffering. The Stolpersteine project by Günter Demning, which began as an act of guerrilla art in defiance of the existing limits of memorialization, mark the homes of victims of Nazism and the Holocaust through the placement of small paving stones. This project is the most evident way that the commemoration of Jews has spread from single spots, but to now occupy large swaths of urban geography in Germany, but also in cities throughout Europe, where in toto there are now more than 50,000 stones placed in many countries. While this is just a small number of the actual victims of the Nazi regime, it begins to give some sense of the space of the impact, the way monuments with lists of names began to give a sense of the enormous number of individual victims. Similarly, in Paris, over 400 plaques have been placed around the city showing the places from which Jews, and especially Jewish children, were rounded up or detained as part of the deportation of Jews from Paris by the Vichy French police, who went to great lengths to fulfill requirements of the Nazi occupiers. The Stolpersteine and Parisian plaques projects, as they have grown in extent, have faced resistance from some local residents. There's always people who complain. Monuments and markers that were planned in isolation are now part of a complex web where one monument might lead to another and support its narrative or continue it. Residents encounter these every day. They may ignore them or only see them as one monument in isolation. Visitors to the city, however, any city really, especially those who seek out Holocaust history, are likely to visit one monument and then another. They crisscross the city following printed or online guides, maps, or lists to find these places. They scour the city for Holocaust memorials the way youngsters look for Pokemon figures using their cell phones. This type of tourism has been described and disparaged as dark tourism. I think for most people, however, this is more akin to a religious pilgrimage. The behaviors are similar to pilgrims visiting Rome or Jerusalem who must see every site of martyrdom and every relic of every saint. It is unclear what these travelers seek, Christian or Jewish: verification, atonement, connection, revelation. I think, however, excitement and titillation are at the absolute bottom of the list. For many decades, in many cases, in many cities, there was often only one memorial monument to commemorate the Holocaust. These were often placed within the walls of synagogues or erected at Jewish cemeteries intended only for Jews. Elsewhere, Jewish life and history before the Holocaust were only dimly remembered, especially in cities where few Jews remained. Holocaust events were suppressed. Physical traces of past people and events were often intentionally erased and even denied. This is not the first time this has happened. The Jewish presence and contribution have been written out of many histories. Only when unambiguous Jewish traces are recovered through archaeological accident, as in Paris and Rouen in France, or Sopron and Maribor in Hungary and Slovenia, or Erfurt and Köln in Germany, must Jewish history be inserted into established narratives. And even this is often resisted. Regarding Holocaust history, the situation is now substantially changed. In many cities across Europe where Jews lived in significant numbers before the Holocaust, there are now many ways in which this history is remembered. One finds memorial plaques, street names, sculptural monuments, historical signage, and Stolpersteine. Dedicated Jewish or Holocaust memorial museums and research institutes exist in good number in Amsterdam, Paris, Berlin, Warsaw, Krakow, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Rome, and many smaller cities. Collectively, in many cities, these now create physical and mental landscapes so that from many memory markers, one can perceive a roughly integrated memorial landscape, a Jewish topography, rather than an isolated point. This is not something new, not something that is overlaid on a city, but something that has lain within. Markers of whatever form encourage or allow this Jewish topography at certain points to emerge, and for the points themselves to be connected. In some cases, like Prague's Josefov, which we see here, teeming with tourists, or Krakow's Kazimierz, which you see here with both religious and secular tourists or pilgrims, and signage, or in Paris in the Marais. The history has been so exposed that a tourist economy is now based on the Jewish past. And we have memorial of the Shoah, we have memorial of more contemporary events, the terrorist bombing on the Rue des Rosiers, the 80s, and so on. These collections of memorials were not planned as part of larger memorial networks, but in the minds and actions of residents and visitors, individual memorials speak to each other across distance. It is not uncommon for Holocaust pilgrims to visit from one place to another, and these monuments also speak to many older memorials across time. A deportation plaque uh, in the Roman ghetto is inevitably linked to the frieze on the Arch of Titus, which is in walking distance in Rome. Even in a place like Rome, where Jews have lived since antiquity and where they have left their mark in many areas of the city, the memorial landscape is concentrated, however, within the area of the ghetto established by Pope Paul IV in 1555, and where the new Tempio Israelitico was dedicated in 1904, 35 years after the emancipation of the Jews. This is partly because of the overwhelming dominance of the Great Synagogue, but it is also significant because it is near many of the historic and artistic sites visited by tourists. The Jewish history that is memorialized in Rome is the Jewish presence of the past, not of today. North African Jews, for instance, particularly those from Libya, who comprise a significant part of the Roman Jewish population, are not really represented in the city's monuments. A Holocaust memorial is inscribed on the side of the synagogue building facing the Tiber River and the Vatican across the river, the Pope's home. The synagogue sits midway between the dome of St. Peter's Church and the Victor Emmanuel Monument, which celebrates the ruler who emancipated the Jews. On one side of the Piazza Venezia, and you see the monument on the left, on one side of the Piazza Venezia is the Palazzo della Assicurazione Generale, which was the Rome headquarters of the Jewish founded and owned international insurance company founded by the Morpurgos family from Trieste, which Mussolini took over, had purged of 20 Jewish directors and 60 Jewish staff in 1938. Morpurgo and others had to flee Italy, mostly for the New World. In Holland, the Auschwitz monument in Amsterdam is placed in the Wertheim Park, the city's oldest park, named after the Jewish banker and philanthropist A.C. Wertheim, who died in 1897, and is remembered with a monumental fountain. So one sees not just a monument to Auschwitz, but one begins to understand the deeper, longer Jewish presence in the city as public benefactors. In Berlin, a monument to Gotthold Lessing is situated in the Tiergarten, built in 1890, with a bronze representation of Jewish philosopher Moses Mendelssohn. A Holocaust monument was installed in 1985 outside the Jewish cemetery Grosse Hamburger Strasse, where Mendelssohn is buried. And you see his new gravestone here, which was installed when this cemetery was restored. Also in the Tiergarten is the memorial to the persecution of homosexuals, and nearby are the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, which you all know from 2005, and now more recently the memorial for the murdered Sinti and Roma from 2012. And these are interspersed with some of the most recognizable monuments of Imperial Germany. So there are these constellations of monuments that we have to consider that talk to each other. These associations heighten the meaning of Holocaust monuments, and then they hint at the world that was destroyed. Even if one is not looking for evidence of the Holocaust, but is just in search of Jewish history, it is inevitable that one will encounter Holocaust memorials. For example, one may be interested in the early history of the Venetian ghetto, but while taking in the buildings of the 16th century, one will inevitably look at the bronze reliefs by the Lithuanian artist Arvid Blatas that depict the murder of Jews really in Lithuania. These were installed in 1980 on the 16th century Campo del Ghetto Nuovo, where the first ghetto was established in 1516. It goes similar if one goes to Vienna in search of the medieval synagogue, which has now been excavated and is in an underground museum. One will learn of its destruction in the 15th century from a still extant inscribed plaque from that time, celebrating the reuse of the synagogue stones in the building of the university. But one will also see as the 21st century center point of the Judenplatz, the large monument by British sculptor Rachel Whitehead that dominates the space. This experience is repeated over and over in Europe, especially where there are areas recognized as the historic Jewish quarter. Sometimes local officials want to link persecutions of different centuries, but more often there's an avoidance to suggest recurring patterns of repression and discrimination. Of course, Holocaust history is not the only history or the only Jewish history commemorated in the streets of European cities. It is a late arrival and competes for public space and attention with thousands of indicators and memorials of other events from other times, especially those used to construct and reinforce national and religious narratives. Memorials for Jews of all periods are interwoven across this urban landscape with these other stories. Occasionally, Jewish monuments or monuments to prominent Jews are also included as parts of larger local or national histories. There are not many public statues to Jews in cities of the world, but there are some and the number is growing. It appears that several cities, perhaps in an effort to make Jewish tourism less dark, have allowed or even sponsored statues of prominent pre-Holocaust Jews. These include rabbis, Maimonides, Rabbi Lew, the Vilna Gaon, that you see here, writers like Shalom Aleichem and Kafka, and philanthropists. And the most recent addition is the imaginative statue of the Jewish woman financier, Lycorizia of Winchester, in the town of Winchester. In Paris, there is a statue of Captain Dreyfus in a private place, the courtyard of the Jewish Museum, some of you may know it, while a statue of Leon Blum stands outside one of the arrondissement town halls. Between these two statues are the many new plaques on building walls, especially schools, commemorating Jews who were rounded up and deported to the Velodrome d'Yves. Several memorials set up at different times with different messages now commemorate these horrific events. Since the Holocaust, many writers and artists have sought to define and describe the sense of Jewish absence in the thousands of spaces and places now empty of Jews. They have especially been drawn to the empty places in cities where they have documented the erasure of the Jewish presence through the demolition of old neighborhoods and the construction of new buildings where one feels the eerie presence of dead Jews in those streets and even in those streets that have been retained. Sometimes there is just one small reminder that there were once many Jews in this place, like a mezuzah or something. Other times, every step seems to reveal some past Jewish presence. Since the early 1990s, when Shimon Atti created his temporary photo projections of long dead Jews on surviving places in Berlin, there has been an artistic movement to give physical form to this ghostly presence. In Berlin, Karl Biedermann created the Abandoned Room, which was installed in 1996. It's a bronze sculpture so natural that one can mistake the table and two chairs as the real thing, though in fact they are slightly bigger than normal and cast in bronze. And yet these cannot be normal. They sit on a faux parquet floor in a room with walls and ceiling, but within a city park. This represents the room of an ordinary apartment house that has been left in a hurry. Were the residents who so recently sat at the simple table arrested and deported, or did they leave suddenly, saving themselves as refugees on the run? Sadly, we must think the former. In Krakow's Ghetto Heroes Square, Peter Lewicki and Kazimierz Łatak have filled the former Zgody Square with empty chairs to recall that this was the Umschlagplatz of the Nazi-created wartime ghetto. And in Budapest, shoes have been left along the embankment of the Danube to mark the spot where Jews were shot and thrown into the icy water by local fascists. Another obvious way of marking what is lost, however, is the placement of plaques and monuments on the sites of destroyed synagogues. This is fast becoming one of the most common types of Holocaust-related memorials in Germany, where so many synagogues were destroyed on Kristallnacht and their ruins fully demolished into the 1950s. Since Jews were no longer required to reside in restricted areas in the 19th and 20th century, inevitably, these former synagogues or their sites are scattered throughout city neighborhoods. Consequently, when these sites are marked, the Jewish memorial landscape spreads much more widely throughout the city. And this is the case, for example, in Vienna, where there are now markers on sites of over 20 synagogues that were destroyed on Kristallnacht. 80 years after the end of the Holocaust, there are still hundreds, perhaps thousands of sites of former synagogues which are not marked. It's very likely, however, that many of them will be marked in coming years because the process continues. And I should mention that the Fehrenbach monument for the synagogue described on Münchnerstrasse has been very well described in a wonderful article, now a chapter in the book by my colleague Natasha Goldman, which I recommend. And so to close, I'll end with some, one more monument from Germany of the many. This is Osnabrück, the home of the painter Nussmann. I'll end with images from Lviv, Ukraine, where many of our colleagues from the Center for Jewish History, for Urban History, and other civic groups who facilitated this project are now having to change their focus in wartime. The spaces of synagogues commemorate destroyed Jewish monuments in the last Great War to cross Ukraine. And these people who worked hard to create this memorial space are now facing more destruction in their own city. We know that they are desperately helping the needy in their city to survive. And I just want to end by saying that our prayers are with them. I will say that since each synagogue was the heart of the community, there's hope that when the synagogue is marked, there'll be a ripple effect of memory to spread into the adjoining streets, where a combination of techniques, physical, digital, and participatory, will continue to fill the empty memory spaces in the cityscape. This was certainly the intention in Lviv, and other creative planners are striving to do the research and to implement the projects, similar projects in other cities, and we look forward to these results. Thank you.